Hi, welcome to today's webcast. I'm Bruce Carton, the editor of Securities Docket. I will be hosting today's webcast, which is brought to you by Securities Docket and our sponsor today, Ankara Consulting. Ankara is an independent global expert services and advisory firm that delivers services and end-to-end solutions to help clients at critical inflection points related to conflict, crisis, performance, risk, strategy, and transformation. The Ankara team consists of more than 2,000 professionals serving more than 3,000 clients across 55 countries who are leaders in their respective fields and areas of expertise. So today's webcast is an FCPA update, recent developments and recurring compliance blind spots. Our guests today are James Koukios from Morrison Forster, Sonali Patel from Mayer Brown, Charles Kane from the SEC, and Bernard Wolfley from Ankara. Before we hear from our guests, let me quickly go over the agenda for today. We're scheduled to go for about an hour. I'm going to give a very quick introduction here, then we'll jump right into the presentation. We welcome your questions. Your questions are anonymous. Don't hesitate to ask any question you may have. To ask a question, just click on the questions box and type your question in. We'll get to as many as we can. You can watch the webcast in a full screen mode. Just got to click on the icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your webcast player. So let me quickly introduce our panelists today. Start with Charles Kane from the SEC. He is chief of the FCPA unit based in Washington, D.C. Has been with the Division of Enforcement for 26 years. Charles' role includes oversight of the National FCPA program, coordination with domestic and foreign law enforcement, and supervision of individual investigations. Charles, welcome.
Or maybe find my unmute button. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. Next, let me introduce James Koukios, a partner at Morrison & Forster. James is also based in Washington, D.C. He's co-chair of the firm's Securities Litigation and Enforcement and White Collar Group and co-head of the FCPA practice. James spent 10 years at the DOJ, first as an AUSA in Miami, but then later as senior deputy chief of the Criminal Division's fraud section in DC. James, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Next, I'm very pleased to introduce Sonali Patel, who is a partner at Mayer Brown. She's also based in Washington, DC. She has 10 years experience at the DOJ, where she served as an assistant chief. Before that, as a trial attorney in the FCPA unit. It's great to have you with us, Sonali.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
And finally, very pleased to welcome Bernard Wolfley. He's a senior managing director at Ankara. Bernie's based in Washington, D.C. He's a CPA with over 25 years as a forensic accountant, handling investigations into fraud and accounting improprieties for both public and private companies. Bernie, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
All right, it should be a terrific panel. I'm going to turn this over to James. Take it away, James.
Thanks, Bruce. So Charles, I'm going to start with you. As the year comes to an end, this is a good time for us to step back and reflect on the past year in FCPA enforcement. And if I have the numbers right, as of today, the SEC has brought 5 FCPA-related corporate enforcement actions in 2024. In your view, what are some of the important lessons from those cases?
Thanks, James. Before I get started, I have to give the standard government speaker disclaimer. My views are my own, don't necessarily reflect the views of the commissioners or other members of the commission staff. As you said, as of today, 5 corporate enforcement resolutions this year. There's a few takeaways. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of what each of these cases were, but the year started with a resolution with SAP that was done in coordination both with the department, who historically we do a lot of parallel matters with, but also with South African authorities. And, one thing you've probably heard myself or others from the SEC and folks from the department talk about the importance of international coordination, cooperation. Cooperation has always been instrumental because we can't get the evidence otherwise. But in the recent years, we have an ever increasing amount of parallel resolutions that we're doing, coordinating with our foreign law enforcement partners. And this was one of them. The other thing about the matter itself, it touches on like 2 things in my mind. One is how control weaknesses, like the breadth and scope of how those can impact your business. Here, our resolution involved 7 different countries. It included multiple countries in Greater Africa, as well as Indonesia and Azerbaijan. And one of the problems is another thing that we see all the time is third parties. Here, it was business development partners, kind of like finders. The company has since terminated that program. But as with many third parties, in particular finders, they can pose problems for the business. Another one, a more recent resolution was with DEER. And for me, it kind of highlights something we see periodically and is a good reminder for acquisitions. Here was a company that had acquired, a standalone entity, and there wasn't timely integration into its existing compliance and internal control environment. And so problems that had existed before the acquisition continued after the acquisition. And then one other matter I just wanted to briefly touch on is Raytheon, which I think is unusual in as the amount of U.S. government participation. I mean, here we had, in coordination with both the Eastern District of New York, the District of Massachusetts, it didn't just have FCPA component. It also had False Claims Act, Fraud Against the United States, International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and Arms Export Control Act. So multiple pieces of the DOJ that we were coordinated with. So it's unusual to that extent. It's also unusual as a resolution itself. It was nearly a $1 billion resolution, and of that, ours was about 124 million of it writ large. But again, it's another one that kind of shows just how widespread and impactful these problems can be. You think you just have an FCPA program, but depending on what line of work you're in, what your business is, you can have a lot of other serious violations of law at issue.
Thanks for that, Charles, and thanks for the tease, the as of today. DOJ did say at the ACI FCPA conference last week that they expect one more. So I'm gonna infer that that's gonna be a coordinated resolution with DOJ and SEC. You don't have to confirm or deny, but that's what I'm inferring. So now let's turn to the DOJ side. As of today, to emphasize that phrase from Charles, DOJ has brought 7 FCPA-related corporate enforcement actions and had 1 FCPA declination under the corporate enforcement policy in 2024. In your view, especially as somebody who's recently left the department, what are some of the important lessons from those cases?
I think there are a few important points that, come when we look at the cases from this year. The first, and I think one of the most important, is that there really was an incredible diversity this year in the resolutions in terms of both the countries involved and the types of industries. I think in the past, we've seen a lot of resolutions involving extractive industries, things like that, mining, oil and gas. But this year, there was a global technology company, there was a global consulting company, there was a defense company, there was, a telecommunications company. So I think the breadth of just the types of companies that were involved in resolutions this year was very unique. And I think that's something that will continue. I think we'll continue to see a diversity in the types of companies that are involved here. And there was also a diversity in the number of countries involved, right? South Africa, Indonesia, Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador. That's also, I think, an important factor that we'll continue to see. And I would piggyback on Charles's point in terms of the number of resolutions that involved other countries. SAP was the second resolution involving South Africa. Gonvor involved Switzerland. So there's just increasing international cooperation, and I think we can expect that to change. The second key point is one that I think everyone listening today is really familiar with, that third parties continue to be a problem. In almost every resolution this year and in a number historically, the bribes have been paid through third parties, and that means that there hasn't been appropriate diligence conducted. There have been a lot of sham contracts. So that's a theme I think that we'll continue to see. Another theme, I think, is that over the past few years, especially with the department, there have been a lot of resolutions involving commodities trading companies. There were 2 this year with Gunvor and Trafigura. A number of the individual resolutions this year involved commodities traders and people involved in that industry. And so that, I think, is something that we'll see continue. Another trend, and this is one that has been, over the last few years, is that most of these resolutions also involved individual cases. So sort of, the department is kind of putting its money where its mouth is. There are a lot of statements by senior leaders in the department about how important individual accountability is in corporate criminal cases. And that has been true with the resolutions this year.
Great. Well, Bernie, we just heard from the enforcement side about the lessons from this year's enforcement actions. As a forensic accountant, were there any corporate enforcement actions that really kind of piqued your interest on either the SEC or the DOJ side?
Yeah. So look, first of all, I think it's important to note that some of the DOJ conduct that was in their documents is a bit older than what was more recently in the SEC. And so you're actually looking, controls have been around for a long time, but there's been a lot of focus on them in the last few years at a lot of companies developing more robust controls. I do think, when I take a look at these, the things that jumped out at me were the needs for companies to really focus more on detection controls. There were several of these documents that summarize the conduct that went to great lengths to talk about the good policies and procedures that the company had in place, but then said those were circumvented by the individuals who were conducting the misconduct. And so how a company looks to detect those efforts to circumvent policies and procedures, I think, is a really important element for people to take away from these. You can set up all sorts of good policies and procedures, put them in place, but it's the testing of those procedures, it's the controls to identify them. I'll tell you, in one case, the agreement was executed on day 1, and on about day 6 is when they asked to make the first payment, for that. And that type of situation is something that somebody in the payment function should be looking for. If you make a contract for a lot of services, a lot of work on April 10th, and on April 15th, the first invoices come in for a sizable amount of money, that seems to me to be the types of things that folks in the payment processing, there can be reasons for why that occurs, but that's a good time when somebody raises their hand and says, this has to be looked at by compliance. And so putting in those types of controls would be really helpful for a lot of these companies.
Great. So Charles, turning back to you, one of the themes that both you and Sonali mentioned was the wide geographic range involved in this year's FCPA enforcement actions. I think if I counted right, between the two agencies, there were at least 18 different countries mentioned in the enforcement actions. And Sonali also mentioned there's a wide variety of industries involved. Any thoughts on why FCPA issues are so widespread across both geographies and industries?
Yeah, I don't have anything more insightful other than the concept that if you do business internationally and you have a lot of government touch points, you're at a greater risk for potential violation. Sonali mentioned, extractive industries have, long seen FCPA problems because it's, I don't know if it's a trifecta or more. You have, highly regulated areas. Oftentimes, the resource itself may be in a part of the world that has greater endemic corruption than other places. You often find a lot of third parties involved in helping companies get to ground there. But really, there's no industry that's immune. It's been quite a few years now at this point. I don't even want to try to remember exactly how many. But when we did our first financial services FCPA case, everybody, it was kind of like, wait a minute, eye-opening moment. Financial services, I thought that was all, defense contractors, extractive industries, whatever it may be. But really, there's no industry that's immune from a potential problem. And as businesses have just gotten more and more global, it's just enhanced the risks. And if you grow through acquisition rather than accretively, I think that, adds to the risk as well.
I think you also mentioned in your opening remarks, control failures can spread, right? If you've got the same control failure across the company, then that can also lead to FCPA problems across the globe.
Yeah, definitely. And especially if there's different things like you got to write decentralized systems, or on the flip side, regionally centralized systems. So the decentralized, that creates its own problems. But if you have regional oversight, well, if that region is a problem, it could expose many, many parts of your business and many countries under the umbrella to the enhanced risk as well.
So now picking up on something you mentioned in your themes of the year, trials and individual prosecutions. So there were 4 trials so far in 2024 in FCPA related cases, all of which resulted in convictions. Why is individual accountability so important to the enforcement agencies? And how can companies use these trial convictions in their own compliance messaging?
James, I think that individual accountability is so important because at the end of the day, every crime is based on the individual, right? It doesn't matter if it's corporate crime. It doesn't matter if it's violent crime. It starts with the individual who's engaged in that criminal act. Obviously, with corporations, there can be things like, the culture of the corporation that can lead individuals to engage in misconduct. But at the end of the day, it's about the individual involved. And I think the department especially has long realized that it's important to hold individuals accountable when they engage in corporate crime. It started, the Yates memo back in 2016. And I think there's been an increased focus on that under Dag Monaco. She's made a lot of statements about how individual accountability is really important in corporate cases. I think where that comes into compliance messaging is that, it's important for companies to emphasize that individuals are not going to be left behind, right? There's not just going to be a corporate resolution and then the individuals will be off the hook. The department has been very aggressive about pursuing individual cases. And so individuals need to be really careful with their behavior, and the company can emphasize that, compliance starts with each person. And I think that's really important for companies to make that message clear. I think a lot of the times compliance can be this sort of amorphous thing and people can think it's, not really up to one person. But I think emphasizing how the department really does go after individuals when it encounters corporate crime can help companies enhance their messaging.
Thanks. I think the focus on individuals actually goes back much farther than that. I was hired to the FCPA unit in 2009 to focus on individuals, and one challenge I always saw was, sometimes maybe folks in the just to pick a South Africa office don't always see why this is important to them, or conversely, even if you're in the United States, if some small business person gets held liable for an FCPA violation, what does that matter to a corporate executive? And so I think, these are things that really need to be put into training programs and brought home to folks, why is this important to you? And really kind of emphasize those things. But Charles, you've been with the SEC for 25 years, serving under Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and soon to be Trump again. So I'm going to draw on that experience to ask you, and I'm sure a lot of people are curious about this. How have changes in administrations over the year impacted FCPA enforcement? And what do you expect could change, or what do you expect will not change in FCPA enforcement during Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I wish I could tell the future, because then I would be retired on my own private island years ago. But as you said, been at this for a while and have done FCPA enforcement for the vast majority of my career in one form or the other. And the one thing that, at least from my perspective, over that entire timeline is the SEC has been committed to enforcing the FCPA. There may be, more broadly, changes in focus on, programmatic priorities, because, there's a vast panoply of securities laws. And, there have been periods of times when there was a greater focus on, say, accounting fraud, whatever it may be. Obviously, in the recent past, it's been crypto securities. So inevitably, there will be some change in focus with the passage of time. We're an independent agency, so changes of administrations seem to not impact us as much, certainly as executive members of the executive branch. But my prediction is continued robust enforcement.
Paul Atkins was a commissioner back in the earlier part of your career at the SEC, but really kind of, I think, left as FCPA enforcement started to ramp up. Do you have any insights or experience with Mr. Atkins that might give you some glimpse into how he might approach FCPA enforcement if he's confirmed as chair?
Yeah, I mean, he left before the unit itself was formed, but certainly not. He was certainly we had FCPA matters when he was a commissioner. I can't for the life of me recall how we voted, but a lot of people have spoken very highly of how he is to interact with. That was my experience. So I'm expecting somebody who's very thoughtful and committed to the work of the agency.
Great. And so now I turn into you from a DOJ perspective. What are your predictions?
James, I was at DOJ during the Trump administration and for almost all of the Biden administration. So I can say that during the time that I was there, in terms of the work that the unit did, it didn't really change. And I expect that will remain true in the next administration. I think one of the things that's important to remember about the FCPA unit and the fraud section generally, and you're obviously very familiar with this, is that it's staffed by career employees, and that the career employees are going to keep doing their jobs just like they have under the previous administration and in the next administration. And another thing that's really important to remember is that FCPA cases are long. So often a case that starts in one administration will end in another. The statute of limitations is 5 years. In major corporate cases, often companies will agree to tolling agreements. There can be tolling pursuant to requests for information, pursuant to mutual legal assistance treaties. So the investigations are lengthy and they go on for a long time. I think the prosecutors in the unit are going to do what they've continued to do, sort of throughout the history of the unit, which is they're going to follow the evidence. And so even if there, might be talk of different regional focuses or things like that, at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do about that. You have to follow the evidence. And if the evidence is there, you might be able to resolve a case. And if the evidence is not there, then you won't. So I don't really think that is going to change. I think a lot will depend on who becomes the Assistant Attorney General for the criminal division. But I suspect that the cases will continue to move along in the way that they have moved along historically, and that the unit will continue to be as busy as ever.
Yeah, and of course, President Trump has not nominated anyone for the AAG over criminal yet, but he has nominated Pam Bondi as Attorney General. Any thoughts on how Ms. Bondi might approach the FCPA?
Look, I think Ms. Bondi is a career prosecutor. She spent a lot of time in a prosecutor's office. I don't know that she was dealing with that much FCPA enforcement in Florida, but I think she certainly understands how criminal cases are built. So my expectation is that she will approach FCPA cases in the same way that she'll approach any other kind of case. I don't expect that this administration is going to decide that the sort of prosecution of corporate crime is no longer important. Again, there may be changes in emphasis. There always are. There were between the Obama administration and the Trump administration and the Biden administration. But I suspect that in terms of the overall sort of enforcement strength, it will continue as is.
Great points by both of you. And I think, just to step back for a moment, FCPA enforcement really took off under the George W. Bush administration and then continued to increase through all subsequent administrations. So to date, at least, it's been kind of a bipartisan issue from that respect. And I think you both mentioned there's presently a lot of resources and a lot of career enforcement attorneys who are pursuing these cases right now. So a lot of reasons to believe that it's going to stay the same under 2.0. Charles, one of the themes that you mentioned in your opening remarks was the importance of post-acquisition integration. And you also mentioned that, one of the issues you see is when companies grow by acquisition, sometimes there may be some issues, FCPA issues, that they acquire through that. So maybe we can just, if you can take a moment and tell us some of the missteps you've seen companies make, both in the pre-acquisition anti-corruption due diligence phase and the post-acquisition integration. And also, if you've got some things that went right from your perspective.
Sure. I'll start with the ones that went right, because it certainly have been, and it really, like the spectrum of what I've seen over the years, it's pretty wide. But the ones I've seen go right, companies who, depending on how much pre-acquisition due diligence they're able to do, right? It'll depend on the industry, et cetera, et cetera. But I can certainly think of some companies that came in to both us and the department and said, hey, we're doing this. We have some concerns, even before the transaction closed, and said, this is our plan for what we're going to do post-acquisition. And, they kept us up to date as that was happening in real time. Can certainly think of instances where they've certainly found problems as part of that post-acquisition diligence, when they were truly able to get under the hood. There were some times when, some things went out the door, essentially, before that was all seen. In those instances, neither we or the department brought any kind of an action. And, the companies did what you would hope a good corporate citizen would do, using all available information, taking it seriously, acting swiftly. On the other side of the spectrum, unfortunately, I've seen companies essentially just, buy it lock, stock, and barrel, attach it and move on. And to the extent there's any integration, it may be well down the road. And it's not part of a robust effort at the moment of acquisition to find out, what problems may be lurking under the hood. And when you buy it whole cloth, including the existing management structure, et cetera, don't put your own people really anywhere other than someone to report to. To the extent there are problems, those are going to continue to obviously fester, which isn't to suggest that, you need to make a change in management, but you do need to understand what has been acquired. And then, the timing is important too, right? And that runs the gamut as well. People may have a hint of a problem, but they put it off to really getting a full sense of what problems may be there. And by the end, I can think of a couple of instances as well where, they didn't pay attention timely. Things that were happening continue to happen, went on for years. And they may well, certainly have had an enforcement action by us and a resolution with the department. So I think companies need to take it seriously, right? And we spoke earlier that there's no industry that's immune. Any industry that's working internationally potentially can have a problem, and you have to, tailor the risk appropriately to, what is my inherent risk? Am I doing extraction of resources? Am I a service provider? Am I selling goods? Am I selling highly regulated things like pharmaceuticals? You have to calibrate but you need to do something. Doing nothing is a recipe for a problem.
And Sonali, Charles mentioned that there are instances where companies came in and disclosed issues found during the acquisition stage, and the agencies declined to go forward. Can you talk a little bit about what incentives DOJ in particular has offered companies to get them to focus on M&A related due diligence and integration, and any positive stories you recall from your time at DOJ?
Yeah, I mean, so look, the corporate enforcement policy in the criminal division has long had a presumption of declination where a company undertakes a merger or an acquisition, and through timely due diligence, it voluntarily self-discloses misconduct at the acquired company. It implements an effective compliance program, the acquired entity, and it remediates. Even when there's aggravating circumstances, the department's CEP or the division CEP has provided for a declination. I think earlier this year, the department issued sort of a department-wide M&A safe harbor policy, which everyone here is familiar with, that essentially operates the same way, but it has a timing requirement in it now. And it requires that the company disclose within 6 months of the close of the acquisition. The criminal division's policy did not have a timing requirement. It just sort of, made the same determination about whether or not it was a timely voluntary self-disclosure as it does in other circumstances. But the safe harbor has a 6-month requirement subject to sort of a reasonableness analysis. But I think that 6-month period really incentivizes companies to do appropriate due diligence related to anti-corruption while the transaction is pending, because 6 months is not a lot of time post-close to find those issues. And I think the fact that if a company does do that diligence, maybe it does encounter an issue and it discloses, it can have a declaration, which is a huge, sort of incentive for companies to do that work and to make sure that they know what they're buying. And I think knowing what you're buying helps companies do better integration work after, right? Because they know what the problems are. But the reality is that sometimes a company isn't going to figure that out pre-close. And there are lots of things that companies learn post-close and close in the integration process. And so I think this policy also incentivizes companies to focus on integration from the outset and to do it quickly, to really get their handle around what's going on at the acquired entity. And, in my time at the department, I saw a lot of companies that did that. And, there were a lot of cases that we just, it wasn't even a CEP declination. We just closed the matter because companies were doing the right thing. They conducted diligence. They found an issue. They were able to remediate. And we determined that it wasn't, an effective use of prosecutorial resources. And what I've seen be the most successful is companies that really focus on it, that really make sure that they are expending the resources to do the work during the due diligence and really understand what they're buying, and make sure that they have a plan from day one as to how to integrate this new entity into their business. And I think to Charles's point, these companies didn't replace everyone at the acquired entity, right? But they just made sure that the acquired entity was following whatever their policies and procedures were, and that they had a handle around how the acquired entity was operating, especially in high-risk jurisdictions.
So, Bernie, we just heard about the importance of post-acquisition integration to both DOJ and SEC and the benefits that companies can get from doing that. Give us some practical guidance. What are some best strategies for companies to integrate a new acquisition and hopefully be in a position to either take advantage of the benefits that Sonali and Charles talked about, or to make sure that they're not having future problems post-acquisition?
Yeah, look, Charles and Sonali made reference to doing something that was serious and of substance and also timely. And to me, that is what you really have to focus on when you're doing this. So I get that in a pre-acquisition posture, there may be limits as to what you can do. But the planning process should be started very early on. And you really have to go in with a full scope of what your plan is going to be and creating that plan there. Getting the data early, you may not be able to get in and kick the tires on the systems that are in place until after the acquisition occurs. But getting data early to understand what your risk map looks like and where you're going to want to go and what you're going to want to focus on there, but understanding the products. So if you've got a bunch of distributors out there, who's selling what types of products, who's selling to governments, who's selling to the market, the direct commercial market, what geographies are they in, really focusing on that and doing sort of your own assessment of the risks on the front end and really doing. Then obviously, once you get in to execute on that plan, you're going to want to do it. But to me, one of the biggest areas that I think has always been a challenge for companies is sort of the stopgap measures that you put in place during the integration process. I've routinely been told by companies that, well, we're going in and we're taking a look at it, but they won't be fully under our controls and our structures until we do this big ERP, the new ERP system that's always 3 or 4 years down the road that they're going to do. And you need to come up with, so how are we going to, in the next 3 to 4 years, continue to actually execute on good due diligence, good investigations, good reviews there to make sure that you're not just waiting for this new ERP system that's going to be the answer to everything there, because that's where you really get the problems. Because if you're leaving a lot of the same people in place that are there, they're going to have a reluctance anyway to move to these new systems. They're going to push that time period out. I've routinely sat with the compliance folks who will say, well, the new ERP system, we're going to get them over and integrated within the next 2 years. And then you go talk to the company being acquired, and they say, well, it might be 4 or 5 years, right? And so from my perspective, getting in, having a plan, coming up with the stopgap measures that you're going to do in the short and medium term to make sure that you are addressing the real risks that are there, right now is, I think, the most important thing a company can do to really do this. And if you do that and you go in and explain to the department what you're doing, how you're trying to do this as quickly as possible, show them what you're finding, but how you're automatically remediating that and making sure it won't occur again, right? I think those are the companies that are going to be in the best position to be getting the favorable outcomes at DOJ and at the SEC. So I think those are the things that they have to do.
I'm going to jump in and confirm what Bernie just said, is that everyone's reluctant to come to the government. I get that. They're like, oh, what am I buying? Well, what's going to happen? It's a great unknown. But the only thing I can say is that Bernie is absolutely right, is that the best outcome is if you've come in early, and you've given fulsome disclosure, and you demonstrate that you're trying to do the right thing. Like, I'm not going to suggest it's going to be a painful process, pain-free process, because nobody wants to deal with the government. I get it, but that is the path for the best outcome.
You're a big teddy bear, Charles. I don't know what you're talking about. So Bernie, kind of picking up on some of these practical tips, but moving away from the integration space, how can companies pair data and technology to enhance the compliance team's ability to identify issues that merit further review? And maybe if you could, in answering that question, we received a question from the audience about the effective use of AI in the anti-corruption compliance area. So maybe you can talk about sort of that data, the technology, the AI, and how companies can really use that.
So look, data and tech, pairing the data and getting your hands on the data as, often as possible when you're doing these types of reviews. And whether it's your internal audit teams doing it or your own compliance teams doing it, I think this concept of really trying to mine the data for it, and there's a lot of AI tools out there, but let me give you an example. One of the SEC settlements involved inappropriate conduct on expense reports that were for round dollar amounts, right? That's exactly the kind of thing that a monitoring program can do. I think there's some interesting things that AI is trying to do on expense reports evaluations. Who should be incurring certain types of costs based upon past data? And that's sort of where AI can be very strong, right? Is when it has a pool of past data to look at and then take that and extrapolate it forward. And so I think there's a lot of tools out there that can help you identify these. I think in the same way on due diligence, right? There's a lot of things that are out there, but I want to be clear, right? Like all of these things that we're talking about here, I know we're talking about them in a bribery and corruption perspective, but as a reality, these are all just general business challenges, right? The same challenges that we look at and say, gee, they added a third party that was used to make payments to a government official. That same structure of creating a third party for some type of self-dealing by a company executive is big, right? The same round dollar amounts that were identified in the SEC enforcement action, those same challenges occur regularly on people who are committing expense report fraud, right there. So the AI tools that you're using for this, so a lot of the things that your internal audit is doing has a compliance benefit there. And there can be a benefit for companies. You know, look, compliance and internal audit should be really closely matched on this. And the issues of compliance and identifying the types of transactions they're focused on should really be pushed very much in to that criteria that the internal audit is going to use when it goes out and does its audit, right? And you can leverage that and get some real value out there, because the same things you're looking at from a bribery and corruption perspective will be what internal audit is looking at from the perspective of just general appropriate business practices and things like that. So I think that the AI tools that are out there actually have some real potential value because, like I said earlier, they have that ability to look at a historical pool of transactions and then extrapolate that forward and say, where are the anomalies? And some of that's not even really formal AI as people think about it. This is more about good data analytics, right? And looking at those types of things. So it may not even be all the way to AI, and it may not be the expensive AI undertaking as it is to be looking at what was in the past and what is it now.
Charles, I want to get your reaction to that. And more specifically, does the SEC expect that all companies are going to use the latest technology like AI in their compliance programs? And what impact does a company's use of cutting edge technology have on how you view the effectiveness of a company's compliance program, including how it might impact the decision about whether to impose a compliance monitor in any given case?
Sure. So I love data. I'm going to start with I love data. I get concerned about, the latest whiz bang thing, right? Oh, AI this, AI that. At the end of the day, as Bernie was discussing, it's data, right? Whether you're using a spreadsheet and adding things up with an abacus, it doesn't matter. There's data, and how effective is the tool that you're using, right? Bernie's talking about, round dollar transactions. For a quarter of a century, I've done this accounting fraud cases, and I'm long before round dollar transactions. That's a thing. You can observe it. It's observable. You should be looking for it always, just for a matter of, pure, fiscal governance. Having a tool that does that better, faster, stronger, more, that's great. But if you get that data and it spits it out and say, oh, look, we have 5,000 transactions, round dollar, and they're all in the same region, same part of the business, and nobody does anything with that, I don't care how expensive that AI was to implement. It's not effective. You're not using it, right? So, when you think about a resolution at the end of the day, like, well, is some kind of a corporate monitor appropriate? Well, if you're not using tools effectively, or you're not examining your business, that moves in that direction. That's not going to be the be all and end all. And there's other things like, transactions that are all just falling right below somebody's authorization threshold, right? It's like structuring in money. It's the same thing. Like, oh, I'm going to have $100, $500 transactions so I can give somebody, the money I could never give him on my own. And people should be looking out for that. In my experience, the folks in internal audit are the ones who are identifying these more often than not. And also more often than not, oftentimes what they have found, it falls on deaf ears in a way. It's small dollar. It's not material. We'll get to it. We'll fix it. It's on, management list of things to be remediated, but it's not like, a flashing red light. Well, it's because nobody perhaps gave it a little more thought. Where is this happening? What part of your business? What are the corruption risks in that part of your business? Is it happening on one product line, multiple product lines? Is it in one sales department, multiple sales? Like understanding more than, there's some problems, there's some noise, and we'll get to it. You have to understand it. And and again, people say, it's the government. What do you guys know? You're not in business. I always think if I can think of it, you can think of it. Because I'm just like, a guy working in the government. I don't know your business like you know your business. And if I can think of it and you haven't thought of it, there might be a problem.
So Sonali, Bernie and Charles were talking about use of technology like AI and use of internal audit to identify issues. But let's talk about it, switch gears and talk about another way of identifying potential issues. That's whistleblowers. So in the last year, DOJ has implemented a number of policies designed to encourage more companies and more individuals to report FCPA violations to DOJ, including the whistleblower pilot program. Can you describe that program and explain why DOJ felt the need to create its own program when many agencies, including the SEC, have long had their own whistleblower programs in place?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the impetus for the program was the fact that there are a lot of other whistleblower programs out there. They all work very well, but the department's program was designed to cover gaps in those programs. So in the FCPA space, think about the fact that the SEC's program would not cover a case involving a domestic concern, for instance, right? Because the SEC wouldn't have jurisdiction over that case. So the major focus of the DOJ's program is to really find places where there are gaps in existing whistleblower programs and to fill those gaps in an effort to try to incentivize more people to come and report misconduct to the department. I think that it's still the case, despite all of these data initiatives, despite all the things companies are doing to try to find misconduct by using tools like AI. I think the statistics show that most companies still find out about misconduct the traditional way, which is through whistleblowers. And so by incentivizing that kind of behavior, by incentivizing people to report that misconduct, by incentivizing them financially, because we know that money works, the hope is that that more cases will come to the department. And I think what the department is trying to do through its program is also incentivize companies to take whistleblowers seriously, right? So the department's pilot program includes a provision that says, if a whistleblower comes to the department, but also goes to the company at the same time, the company can still earn credit for voluntary self-disclosure if it comes to the department within 120 days and assuming that the department hasn't already reached out to it. Because what the program is trying to do is to incentivize people to report to their company as well as report to the department. And it's trying to incentivize companies to devote adequate resources to whistleblowers. I mean, to Charles's point, it's the same one, right? He talked about if a company has all this data, if it recognizes a problem, but then it does nothing about it, that's a problem. The same is true on the whistleblower front, right? A company can have a best-in-class system for reporting. It can have a hotline. It can assess those risks. But once they get those reports in, if they don't actually investigate it, that program isn't particularly effective. So I think the department's program is designed to try to help companies also take whistleblowing more seriously. And I think that the recent changes to the ECCP in September of this year sort of go hand in hand with the implementation of the pilot program, right? And really making sure that companies are beefing up their whistleblower programs to make sure that they are following the leads, that whistleblowers are not treated differently than other people who were involved in misconduct who did not blow the whistle, that there's no retaliation. All of the things that we know are sort of important in whistleblower systems. I think the department is kind of taking a two-pronged approach. It's created this pilot program where it's trying to incentivize people to come to the department and incentivize companies to take their whistleblower report seriously and voluntarily self-disclose. And it's also noting that, when department prosecutors are evaluating compliance programs, they're going to be taking a hard look at the whistleblower program at the company to make sure that it operates in a way that's best designed to actually use whistleblower data effectively.
And just for those who aren't as familiar with all the acronyms, you said the ECCP, that's the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs?
That's right.
Got it. Charles, one concern that is often heard when it comes to government whistleblower programs is that they incentivize employees to report problems externally rather than internally, and deprive companies the opportunity to deal with these issues themselves. As someone whose agency has had a whistleblower program for over a decade, what is your response to that concern? And how do you expect that the new DOJ program that Sonali described will work alongside the SEC program?
Yeah, so it's really understand that concern, right? That and I think that when the provisions in Dodd-Frank that created the whistleblower program for us, when the statute was drafted, it tried to find that balance, like the right balance between going internally first and then being able to go to the government. I don't think it's ever going to be perfect from anyone's perspective, but I think it works well. And I could just say, at least anecdotally, from my experience, the vast majority of whistleblowers in practice have gone internally. Most of these people are motivated by wanting to do the right thing, wanting to see something fixed. There's always going to be outliers, but that's the vast majority of them. And that when they do come to the government, it's because they're frustrated by perceived inaction or inadequate action, or just maybe being ignored when they raise their hand, or even further, maybe some kind of retaliation against them for having tried to point out what they perceive to be a problem. So the system, as we have it, it certainly has plenty of room for folks to go internally first. And in fact, certain classes of potential whistleblowers can't even come to the government and be treated as a whistleblower, at least for awards, unless it's 120 days after they raise their hand internally. There's another exemption for they don't have to do that if it was clear their superiors already were aware of the problem. But at any rate, I see that most of these people are really motivated by trying to do the right thing. I think that the idea of an award system, it's important to have because many of these folks are putting their future livelihood at risk. While our program is confidential, it's anonymous. Sometimes people either self-identify later on, or people in the industry believe they must have been it, and they're basically blackballed. And they're out of work. So absent some financial incentive, created a huge hardship for these people to raise their hand, and they have brought truly significant matters to the SEC's attention, across all of our program areas. So I hope the department is going to have growing pains. It's a pilot. They're but I'm sure that we're going to have the same thoughts in mind as they devise a development. It's not just us. There's other parts of the government. The CFTC has a whistleblower program, and I'm sure they'll be informed by our experiences, positive and negative, to make it the best it can possibly be.
Bernie, do you have any thoughts on how companies can enhance their speak up programs including in ways that companies can appropriately encourage employees to report internally rather than going to the government in the first instance?
Yeah, I think doing something in a timely fashion is a real important component. And to me, the data side of things comes in here. When you get something that comes in and says, my manager has set up some businesses and is cheating the company out of monies or has an interest in whatever, right? You have, if you're the compliance group right down the hall, somebody, whether they're an internal audit, somebody in the accounting group, or if you've built up the function, you've got your own people who can do this, who can quickly pull, all of the businesses under that individual scope and see who's getting payments, getting some understanding of that, and quickly seeing whether or not look, you're always going to have to investigate the whistleblower allegation all the way through. But are there some obvious answers that jump out at you or areas of immediate concern that can be done there? And, a lot of times when I've talked to folks, it seems like we spend a lot of time going out to interview folks and talk to folks and things there. Getting the data on the front side of that to really understand what is there and what is getting used to make sure, look, if the person hasn't approved a new vendor in 4 years, right, there might be something that's very different going on here than if all of a sudden there's a new vendor that's been put in place and a lot of money went right out to them. And, I think there's a lot that can be done with the data to make to start filling in the information surrounding the whistleblower allegation there, whether it serves to more fully support it or whether it tends to say maybe that what is being alleged is more of a perception as opposed to something that's really a reality. But I think the data is going to help you answer the questions either way, and I think it helps you get to the answers faster.
Great. Well, we are almost out of time here, and I see Bruce has come back on the screen. So, Bruce, let me kick it back over to you.
Thank you, James. And thanks to everybody. That was a terrific webcast and a great update and look ahead. Thank you. If the audience would just take a moment and click on the ratings button at the top and provide us with any feedback you may have, we'd really appreciate it. On behalf of Securities Docket, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank our guests, Charles Kane, James Koukios, Sonali Patel, and Bernie Wolfley, and a special thanks to Ankara for making the webcast possible. The webcast has been recorded. It'll be available as an archive shortly on Securities Docket. That concludes the webcast. Thank you all, and I hope you'll join us again soon.
Thanks, everyone.